a lovely, relaxing bath. Oh. What's that? Oh no! The video! What am I gonna do? Suppose I'll have to get out now. Oh god. Well, wasn't that full anyway? Right, well, hello and welcome anyway. It's the next instalment, and today we're going to pick up on one of our mechanisms of social learning which we didn't go into quite enough detail last time, and that's imitation. Let's start with a definition of imitation then. It's when an observer performs the same action as a demonstrator as a result of seeing the act performed. And as we mentioned in the last video, it has to imitate the exact topography of that behaviour, and that behaviour must be novel, it must be completely new. Now, we've known about imitation in the animal kingdom for a long time. We know that many passerine birds imitate others. Starlings were particularly good at this actually, and there's an experiment on starlings which I'm going to be coming on to in just a second. It's a well-known fact that coal miners used to take canaries down, into mines, and then because they were susceptible to methane, so they would die, they would literally fall off their perch before the miners would, okay? So it was a safety precaution. And what the miners did is that they taught the canaries the calls of loads of other different birds. They played them loads of different bird calls, and the canaries would imitate this. So that would mean they would have a larger repertoire, right? So it was known outside of academia for a long time. But one of the greatest experiments was done on starlings, which are pretty intelligent birds all round, in my opinion. Now, it's important when doing these experiments to rule out all other possible mechanisms of social learning, and you can do that by either having a bidirectional or a two-action task control. And this experiment did both of these. A guy called Fawcett and his mates did it, right? Now, in the bidirectional control experiment, starlings were trained to either push or pull a lever to receive a food reward. Now, it's important to have loads of different demonstrators to increase the reliability of these results, okay? So observers were allowed to observe these demonstrators pushing or pulling the stopper to release food, okay? Some were trained to push, some were trained to pull, right? And then what the scientists did, that they tested the observers, but it was important just to note their first response, okay? Any response after their first, they may have not got from imitation, they may have got from individual learning, okay? So if someone who watched a starling push the stopper as their first response, then that's a sign that they may have imitated the demonstrator. And this is exactly what was seen. If the demonstrator's action was to push, the observers pushed 15 out of 16 times, and when a statistical test called the Fisher's exact test was conducted, this proved to be extremely significant, okay?
Now, something I forgot to mention was to say that to test that this was due to the presence of the demonstrator, then you must have something what's called a ghost condition. This rules out goal emulation. So this was achieved by simply moving the plug, either pushing it or pulling it, using a thread without a bird being there at all. Okay? And then to watch what the observer birds actually did. If they were able to work it out with just a thread pushing or pulling the button, then this is an example of goal emulation, not imitation.
A two-action task control is kind of similar, but in this case, one group of starlings was trained to push the stopper with its beak to receive food, and the other group was trained to push the stopper with its foot, okay? Both ways of doing it would result in food being given to the birds, okay? So that's what's interesting about this. So it's two actions which both lead to the same outcome, and this rules out any goal emulation. Remember what we were talking about with the blue tits and the great tits opening the milk bottles last time? Okay, and this, when the Fisher's exact test was conducted, this also proved to be significant. And this is one of the strongest pieces of evidence of imitation in animals. Now, we're going to move on to culture now. Now, culture in animals to many of you may seem ludicrous, but of course we need to define what we mean by culture. So let's have a look at definitions, shall we? So cultural transmission is the behavioural techniques that are transmitted socially and persist over generations. A great example of this was up in the Jerusalem pine forests. And you know what? We've got a bit of money to spare on this show. I'm off to the Jerusalem pine forest, so I'll see you later. Hello, and welcome to the Jerusalem pine forest. It's lovely. God, the budget on the show has suddenly shot up, hasn't it? And it's here where our next case study of cultural transmission is. And it's in black rats. Now, in the Jerusalem pine forests, black rats are the only arboreal animals. They've really got it all to themselves. We used to have black rats in this country, actually. They're what transmitted the Black Death. Horrible thing, but we don't have them anymore, which is very nice. So this is why I've had to travel all the way to Jerusalem to come here. Now, in Jerusalem, they love eating pine cones, right? All of this stuff, and they developed a special technique in which to get at the seeds within the pine cones. Underneath each one of these scales, there's a seed, right? And it's a technique which is called spiral stripping. I'm not going to demonstrate it, but they basically start from the top and spiral all the way down. And this is the most efficient way of getting the seeds from the pine cones. If they did it any other way, then they'd be wasting more energy than they would be gaining, right? So it's very, very useful. Now, a guy called Turkle wants to see whether this was a culturally transmitted behaviour. So he had 3 experiments. In one group, they took a load of naive rats who had never even experienced the idea of spiral stripping before. They were all adults, right? And what he saw was there was some random gnawing, but none of them developed the sophisticated art of spiral stripping, right? In another group, they took a load of naive rats who had never experienced spiral stripping before, but they kept them with a load of rats which had, right? So a load of demonstrators. What do they find? Once again, in these naive rats, they saw a load of random gnawing, but no spiral stripping. So there didn't seem to be any social learning going on here from the rats that did know how to do it. Now, in the third experiment, young rats were taken and they were housed with their mothers, which did know the spiral stripping. Remember, all the rats that we'd used before were adults. These were young ones, and they were housed with their mothers, which knew how to spiral strip. And these young ones did develop the art of spiral stripping. Therefore, there could be a sort of critical period in a rat's life where it can learn this behaviour, possibly through imprinting from the mother. If it doesn't learn it in that critical period, then there's no chance of him learning spiral stripping, right? So this could be a genetic thing. Is the ability to spiral strip within the genome of these animals? Well, this was tested through cross-fostering experiments. So spiral stripping offspring, well, offspring from spiral stripping mothers were reared with parents who couldn't spiral strip, right? And vice versa. And then they tested the young after 3 months to see whether they could spiral strip. And what they found was that all the offspring that were reared with parents that could spiral strip did learn to spiral strip, and ones which had been reared with parents which couldn't spiral strip never learnt the idea to spiral strip. So this shows that this isn't genetic, because it doesn't matter who your mother is, it all depends on who you grow up with to see whether you could actually develop the technique of spiral stripping. Now, another thing that the scientists found out is that they often needed partially stripped cones for them to learn this behaviour. So ones which are sort of, they were given a head start with, okay? So there were 2 things that they needed. A mother, which knew how to spiral strip, and 2 partially stripped cones. Oh, that's a great little trip that. Oh, a bit of a trek, but I made it in the end. So, what were we talking about then? So, When studying culture and traditions, we're looking for population-specific behaviours that persist over generations, right? And this could be applied to tool use, which is actually going to be the topic of our next video. So for example, chimpanzees use sticks and their saliva to fish for termites, right, in logs and whatnot. Now, some populations do this, but some do not. Why is that? Within the ones that do it, they use a variety of different techniques. Some use, sophisticated rods. Some are just a bit violent and just starting smashing termite mounds with rocks. Okay? A bit crazy. Now it's thought that it's the males that transmit this behaviour to their sons, right? But the differences between populations could be due to a whole load of different things. It could be due to individual learning, genetic variation, or ecological differences. Now, an experiment on traditions was done by Thornton on everyone's favourite TV mammal. It's the meerkat, right? And they looked at the emergence times of these meerkats from their underground burrows. And it was done over 11 years in different neighbouring groups. Now, these groups had overlapping ranges and similar habitats, so it controlled for environmental factors. There was also gene flow between the separate meerkat groups. So this, of course, controlled for genetic factors. And over 11 years, meerkats don't live that long, so there was a complete turnover in the members of each group from the start of the 11 years to the end of the 11 years, right? So this controlled for individual learning. Now, Thornton attempted to remove all other possibilities, and he showed that the emergence times of each individual group in the morning is distinct from any other group. So all the members of this meerkat group are synchronising. They may have the same alarm clock or something to make sure that they all emerge at exactly the same time. Which is strange, isn't it? But also very useful, because it helps in detecting predators if you're all up at the same time, alert, ready for action. So you can see how this represents cultural traditions in neighbouring groups. And it's thought that this may have been maintained in these groups through what's called information cascades. Now, I may not be able to take you up to Africa to look at these meerkats, but what I can do is take you up to Whiton Woods in Oxford. Isn't it lovely? Just as good as Africa, I'm sure you'll agree. And another just as good experiment was done here only last year on great tits. Now, great tits are heavily studied here in Whiton Woods. The scientists here know pretty much everything about them, and this experiment was all to do about cultural transmission. So what they did, this is quite a big wood. One great tit was taken from one side of the wood, another great tit was taken from another side of the wood, and they were reared in the lab, right? And what they would do, they were trained in the lab to, in order to get food, there was a feeder with a cap on it, which looked a little bit like this, blue on one side and white on the other. And what the scientists did, that they trained one of the great tits to move the cap from the right, so pushing the white side, to get food, and they trained the other great tit to push the blue side, so move it to the left to get food, right? Now, these great tits were then released into two separate populations, and then what they did, they measured the spread of this behaviour in the population. What they found was that the birds which were trained to move the side from the right, the birds in that population learn to push the slide to the right. Now, in the wild, what they did, they often... This is a sort of feeding station which you'd normally see. There's quite a few of these in Whiton Woods. There's no feeder in this one at the moment. But they're great little cages, and you can put cameras in them, and you can, really scientifically monitor the behaviour of these birds. So, the important point to note is that if the bird pushed this slide right or left, it would still get food. That's the interesting thing about it. So this culture of pushing the slide to the right has been transmitted, even if the bird had pushed it to the left, it would have got food as well. Okay? And what you can also do, through a load of computer mathematical modelling, you could measure the dynamics of the spread of this culture. So you could measure the rate and how fast this behaviour is spreading through a population of great tits. And in control populations, where there was no training of great tits at all, the birds did work it out that they had to push the lever eventually, but it was in no particular direction. So that just proves even further that this culture of pushing the slide a particular way has been transmitted, right? And this continued year upon year. So in future generations, after gaps of not having the feeder, the culture still carried on. Whew, well, wasn't that lovely? Well, that's all I've got time for today. All I've got to say is happy Easter, have a great one, and I'll be back at some point with a video on tool use, which is going to be awesome! 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 See ya.